They called him the Giant of London, a man too big for the law and too dangerous for love. But when the underworld turns on Arthur Thorne, his only hope isn't a hitman, it's the innocent Nanny who sees the man behind the monster. Watch as a ruthless empire crumbles and a forbidden passion ignites in the shadows of a city that never forgets. She said she could handle him, and she was right. The rain drummed against the leaded glass windows of the estate with a relentless, rhythmic persistence, a sound that usually brought Arthur Thorne a sense of order. But on this morning, November 14th, 1997, the grey sky offered no comfort. Arthur, known to the streets as Artie, stood by the window, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric of a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than most men earned in a year. At 34 years old, he was a man built of hard angles and heavy secrets. His hands, currently tucked into his pockets, bore the faint white scars of a youth spent fighting for every inch of sidewalk he now owned. He was a man who had become too big for his own world. His influence stretched across the docks, through the counting houses, and deep into the pockets of men who sat in high places. But as he turned away from the window to look at the silent nursery down the hall, the weight of that greatness felt like a shroud. Since the passing of his wife 2 years prior, the sprawling house had felt less like a home and more like a fortress under siege. His daughter Rose was the only piece of light left in his life, and he was failing her. The previous 4 nannies had fled within a month, terrified by the silent, brooding master of the house and the men in dark overcoats who stood guard at the iron gates. A soft knock echoed through the heavy oak door of his study. It was a modest sound, yet it cut through the silence of the room. "Enter," Arthur commanded, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in his chest. The door creaked open, and Elena stepped into the room. She was 22, with skin the color of cream and eyes that held a startling, quiet intelligence. She wore a simple navy blue dress that reached her knees, her dark hair pulled back into a sensible knot, though a few rebellious strands framed a face that looked entirely too innocent for a house built on blood money. She didn't flinch when his gaze swept over her, a gaze that usually made seasoned soldiers drop their eyes. "You are Elena?" Arthur asked, walking toward his mahogany desk. Every step he took was deliberate, the movement of a predator who had forgotten how to be anything else. "I am, Mr. Thorne," she replied. Her voice was steady, like a calm sea after a storm. It lacked the tremor of fear he had grown accustomed to. Arthur sat behind his desk, leaning back. "You've read the requirements. This isn't a normal household. I am away often. There are rules. There is security. Most people find the atmosphere oppressive." Eleanor walked further into the room, her movements fluid and graceful. She stopped 5 feet from his desk, the scent of lavender and rain-dampened wool trailing after her. "I am not most people, sir. I am here for the child, not the atmosphere." Arthur studied her. He noticed the way her pulse fluttered at the base of her throat, the only sign that she felt the magnetic pull of his presence. He was a large man, standing 6 feet and 4 inches, with a physical presence that seemed to swallow the light in the room. He knew he was imposing, a giant in a world of small men. "My associates tell me I am too big for this life now," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming more intimate. "They say a man like me shouldn't have a weakness like a daughter living in the center of his operations. They say I'm too big to be handled by anyone who isn't already corrupted." He stood up again, rounding the desk until he was inches from her. The height difference was staggering. Eleanor had to tilt her head back to look him in the eye. He could see the gold flecks in her irises. He could smell the heat coming off her skin. He leaned in, his shadow completely enveloping her small frame. "Are you afraid of me, Eleanor?" She didn't move. She didn't even blink. "Size and reputation are just labels, Mr. Thorne. I've spent my life caring for things that others found too difficult. I don't see a monster. I see a father who is terrified of losing the only thing that matters." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension. Arthur felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in years, curiosity, and beneath that, a slow burning heat. He reached out, his large calloused hand hovering near her cheek, not quite touching, but close enough for her to feel the warmth of his palm. He watched her breath hitch, her lips parting slightly. "The pay is 3 times the standard rate," Arthur whispered, his gaze dropping to her mouth before returning to her eyes. But the cost is your peace of mind. You will see things here you cannot unsee. You will hear whispers of a world you were never meant to touch. I can handle the whispers, Elena replied, her voice a soft, defiant breath. And I can handle you. Arthur let out a short, dry laugh, though his eyes remained dark and intense. Many have said that. None have stayed. Then I suppose I will have to be the first, she said. He finally let his hand drop, the air between them still vibrating with the ghost of his touch. He turned back toward the window, the grey London afternoon pressing against the glass. He felt the familiar weight of his empire, the crushing responsibility of being the man everyone feared. But for the first time in a long time, the shadow in the room didn't feel quite so lonely. Rose is in the nursery, Arthur said, his back still turned. Chapter 1 of your employment begins now. Mrs. Higgins will show you to your quarters. Do not disappoint me, Elena. I don't give second chances. I won't need one, she said quietly. As she turned to leave, the sound of her soft footsteps retreating was the only thing Arthur could hear over the rain. He stayed at the window, watching the dark sedans pull into the gravel driveway below. His men were arriving. The business of the day was starting. Blood, debts, and power. But as he watched a single droplet of rain trail down the glass, his mind stayed on the girl with the lavender scent and the steel in her eyes. She was a virgin to this world, an untouched soul entering a den of lions. He told himself he would keep her safe, but as the heavy door clicked shut, he knew he was the one she needed protection from most. The house seemed to exhale as she walked through its corridors. The oak paneling and the marble floors felt a little less cold. Eleanor followed the elderly housekeeper toward the back of the estate, her eyes taking in the details, the lack of dust, the sharp scent of lemon oil, the absence of laughter. It was a place where life was lived in the margins, where every word was measured and every glance was a calculation. When she finally reached the nursery, she saw the little girl sitting on the floor, surrounded by expensive toys she wasn't playing with. Rose looked up, her eyes a mirror of her father's, dark, soulful, and heavy with a sadness no child should carry. Eleanor knelt on the carpet, ignoring the chill of the room, and reached out a hand. "Hello, Rose," she whispered. In the study, Arthur Thorne sat back down and opened a ledger, but the numbers blurred. He could still feel the phantom sensation of her standing before him, the way she had looked up at him as if he were just a man and not a king of the dark. He had been warned he was too big for his own good, that his life was a runaway train. But as the clock on the mantel ticked toward evening, he wondered if he had finally found the one person who could stand on the tracks and make him stop. By the morning of November 17th, 1997, Eleanor had begun to understand the rhythm of the Thorne estate. It was a house that breathed in sync with its master, heavy, guarded, and cold. The architecture was a masterpiece of Victorian stone and cold marble, with ceilings so high they seemed to swallow the warmth of the fires that burned in every hearth. There were 32 rooms in the main house, and yet most of them remained locked, silent mausoleums of a life Arthur Thorne no longer lived. The rules were delivered to her by Mrs. Higgins on a silver tray, metaphorically speaking. There were to be no visitors. There was to be no questioning of the men who arrived late in the evening in dark sedans. Elena was to stay within the nursery wing and the gardens after the sun dipped below the horizon, unless summoned. Most importantly, she was never to enter the third-floor study without an explicit invitation. It was a life lived in a gilded cage, but as Elena brushed Rose's hair that morning, she felt a strange sense of purpose. Rose was a quiet child of 5, a delicate soul who seemed to have forgotten how to laugh. But under Elena's care, the silence was beginning to crack. Elena didn't treat her like a porcelain doll or a burden. She spoke to her about the world outside, about the way the autumn leaves turned the color of hammered copper and the smell of the Thames on a crisp morning. From the shadows of the gallery, Arthur Thorne watched. He had become an expert at moving through his own home like a ghost. He stood in the darkened doorway, his large frame partially concealed by a heavy velvet curtain. He watched Elena sit on the floor with Rose, her navy skirt fanning out around her. She was reading a story, her voice melodic and full of an emotion that he had spent years trying to suppress. Arthur felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the stress of his business. He was fascinated by her resilience. Every other woman who had entered this house had eventually wilted under the weight of his reputation. They had jumped at the sound of a door slamming, or looked at him with eyes full of transactional fear. But Elena was different. She moved with a quiet dignity that suggested she saw the man behind the myth. Later that evening, the air in the house grew thick with the arrival of several of Arthur's associates. The low murmur of male voices drifted up from the dining room, punctuated by the clink of crystal and the heavy thud of a fist on a table. Arthur had spent the last 3 hours debating the expansion of his territory in the East End, but his mind kept drifting back to the nursery. When the meeting finally broke, Arthur stepped out into the hallway to find Elena descending the grand staircase. She had changed into a soft cream-colored knit dress that clung to her curves in a way that was modest, yet undeniably provocative. The fabric looked soft, a stark contrast to the rough stone walls around them. The hallway was narrow, and as they approached each other, the space between them seemed to shrink. Arthur didn't move aside. He stood his ground, a towering wall of muscle and expensive wool. Eleanor stopped just inches from him, the top of her head barely reaching his chest. The scent of her, that intoxicating mix of lavender and something warm and feminine, hit him like a physical blow. "The girl is asleep?" Arthur asked, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to echo in the small space. "She is," Elena replied. She didn't look down. She looked up, her gaze steady and unwavering. "She asked for you, Mr. Thorne. She wanted to say good night." Arthur's jaw tightened. "I was occupied." "You are always occupied," Elena said softly. She reached out, her fingers grazing the sleeve of his jacket. It was a small, almost accidental contact, but the heat of it radiated through the layers of fabric. A man who is too big for his own house often misses the things that make it a home. Arthur's hand shot out, his thick fingers wrapping firmly around her upper arm. He didn't hurt her, but his grip was a reminder of the raw power he possessed. He pulled her a fraction of an inch closer, until he could see the slight tremor in her lips. "You forget yourself, Elena," he whispered, his breath hot against her temple. "You are here to care for my daughter, not to psychoanalyze me." "I haven't forgotten anything," she countered, her voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a caress. "I see the way you look at me from the shadows. I see the way you pace the halls when the house is quiet. You think you're a giant, Arthur, but even giants need to rest." The use of his first name was a bold transgression. Arthur felt a surge of possessive heat. He let his gaze travel down to her throat, where her pulse was racing. He shifted his grip, his thumb tracing the soft skin on the inside of her arm. The contrast between his scarred, rough hand and her silken skin was almost overwhelming. For a moment he wanted to crush her against him, to see if her fire would consume his coldness, or if he would extinguish her light. He leaned down, his lips inches from her ear. "Be careful, little bird. You're playing with a fire that has burned down entire neighborhoods." "Maybe I like the heat," she whispered back. The tension between them was a living thing, a coiled spring ready to snap. Arthur felt his control slipping, a sensation he despised. He was a man of logic and strategy, but in this moment he was nothing but a predator reacting to a challenge. He let go of her arm, but he didn't move back. He watched her take a breath, the movement of her chest drawing his eyes to the soft swell of her breasts beneath the knit fabric. "Go to your room, Elena," he commanded, his voice thick, "before I decide that the rules of this house no longer apply." Elena didn't run. She stood her ground for a heartbeat longer, her eyes searching his as if looking for the crack in his armor. Then, with a slight nod, she turned and walked away. Arthur stood in the hallway, his hands clenched at his sides, watching the sway of her hips as she disappeared into the shadows of the nursery wing. He walked back into his study and poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid burning his throat. He looked at the maps on his wall, the ledgers of his wealth, and the list of men who owed him their lives. He was the biggest man in London, a king in a kingdom of shadows. But as he sat in the silence of his fortress, he realized that for the first time in his life, he was the one who felt small. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. In the nursery wing, Elena lay in bed, her skin still tingling from the ghost of Arthur's touch. She knew she was walking on a knife's edge, She knew that Arthur Thorne was a man capable of great violence and cold calculation, but she had also seen the way his eyes softened when he looked at his daughter, and she had felt the loneliness that radiated from him like a winter chill. She wasn't afraid of the giant. She was fascinated by the man who thought he was too big to be loved. As she drifted off to sleep, the sound of the rain against the window seemed to whisper a warning. The world outside was gathering its forces, and the peace of the Thorne estate was a fragile thing, held together by the will of one man and the quiet defiance of the girl who had promised she could handle him. The morning of November 20th, 1997, arrived with a biting frost that turned the sprawling gardens of the Thorne estate into a graveyard of silver and white. Inside, the heating system groaned against the chill, but the air remained sharp. Arthur Thorne stood in his study, the heavy scent of tobacco and expensive scotch already clinging to the curtains. He wasn't alone. Two men, relics of a London that had mostly been paved over by glass skyscrapers, sat in his leather armchairs. "You're overreaching, Artie," the older one, a man named Silas who had been a lieutenant since the late 70s, said through a cloud of cigar smoke. The docks were one thing, the East End was manageable, but moving into the northern transport hubs? You're making the Crown look incompetent, and you're making the Italians look small. Neither of them likes that. Arthur didn't sit. He paced the length of the room, his movements like a tiger in a cage that was rapidly becoming too small for his ambitions. The world is changing, Silas. If we don't own the roots, we don't own the city. I'm not overreaching. I'm securing our future. You're becoming too big, son, the other man, Victor, added with a gravelly wheeze. When a man gets this big, he stops being a person and starts being a target. There are whispers in the yard. They aren't looking to arrest you anymore. They're looking to dismantle you. Outside the heavy oak door, Eleanor stood perfectly still. She had been on her way to the kitchen to fetch a warm glass of milk for Rose, but the intensity of the voices had rooted her to the spot. She knew she should move, that eavesdropping on men like these was a dangerous gamble, but the word dismantle sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning frost. She heard the weight of his world in those voices, the cold, calculated mathematics of power and the blood price that came with it. "I can handle the yard," Arthur's voice boomed, though it was low and controlled. "And I can handle the Italians." "Can you?" Silas asked. "Because you're distracted. This house, it used to be a fortress. Now it feels like a home. That's a vulnerability, Artie. A man with a heart is a man with a handle, and right now you've got a very pretty handle walking these halls." Eleanor's breath hitched. She felt her face flush with a mix of fear and an inexplicable surge of pride. She wasn't just a nanny to them. She was a variable in a dangerous equation. Suddenly the door swung open. Elena didn't have time to retreat. She stood there, the tray in her hands trembling slightly, as three pairs of eyes landed on her. Silas and Victor looked at her with the cold, predatory curiosity of wolves weighing a lamb. But Arthur's gaze was different. It was dark, turbulent, and possessively intense. "The girl was fetching milk, I presume," Victor said, a thin, oily smile stretching across his face. Arthur stepped forward, his massive frame effectively blocking the two men from Elena's view. He didn't speak to them. He looked down at Elena, his presence so overwhelming that the hallway seemed to shrink until there was only the two of them. "Go to the nursery, Elena," he said. His voice was a warning, but not for her. It was a shield. "I heard them," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire inside the room. She didn't know why she said it, only that she couldn't let him think she was oblivious to the shadows closing in on him. Arthur's jaw tightened. He reached out, his hand gripping the edge of the tray she held. His fingers brushed against hers, a brief electric contact that sent a jolt of heat straight to her core. He pulled the tray slightly, forcing her to look up at him. "It's not your concern. Forget what you heard." "I can't forget that they want to hurt you," she countered, her eyes searching his. The vulnerability she saw there, hidden behind layers of iron and scar tissue, broke her heart. Arthur leaned in, his face inches from hers. The scent of cedarwood and cold air radiated from him. "They can try, but you are the one thing in this house that isn't for sale or for trade. Remember that." He let go of the tray and stepped back, his expression hardening as he turned back to his associates. Elena hurried down the hall, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could feel his eyes on her back, a heavy, warm weight that followed her until she turned the corner. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of forced normalcy. She played with Rose, teaching her how to fold paper cranes, but her mind was in the study. She thought about Silas's words, the idea that she was a handle that could be used against Arthur. She didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a secret weapon she hadn't quite learned how to fire yet. In the afternoon, the house was quiet again. The dark sedans had left, leaving only the tracks in the gravel. Eleanor was tidying the library when Arthur entered. He had shed his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and etched with the stories of his past. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been that morning. He didn't say a word. He walked to the window and stared out at the grey London sky. Elena watched him, the silence between them growing thick and heavy with the things they couldn't say. She walked toward him, her footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. When she was standing beside him, she reached out, her fingers tentatively touching the skin of his forearm. He didn't pull away. Instead, he let out a long, ragged breath. "They think I've grown too big, Elena. They think the weight of what I've built is going to crush me." "Is it?" she asked softly. He turned to her then, his hand coming up to cup her jaw. His thumb traced the line of her lower lip, a slow, sensual movement that made her knees weak. The contrast between his rough, calloused hand and the softness of her face was a physical ache. "I've spent 15 years becoming the man everyone fears. I thought that was enough. But then you walked through that door with your lavender scent and your eyes that see too much, and suddenly I'm not sure if I'm building an empire or a prison." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. Their breaths mingled in the cool air of the library. Eleanor could feel the heat of his body, the raw, masculine power that he usually kept under such tight control. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. She could feel the steady, powerful thrum of his heart beneath the thin fabric of his shirt. "You said I was a handle," she whispered. "If that's true, then use me to stay steady. Don't let them take what you've built." Arthur's grip on her jaw tightened, his fingers sliding into her hair. He pulled her head back, forcing her to look at the hunger in his eyes. It was a look that promised both protection and destruction. "You have no idea what you're asking for, Elena. This world, it doesn't just touch you, it consumes you." "Then let it consume me," she said, her voice filled with a sudden, fierce conviction. "I told you I could handle you, Arthur. I meant it." He didn't kiss her, but the way he looked at her was more intimate than any touch. It was a promise, a claim, and a warning all rolled into one. He was a man who had been told he was too big for his own good, a giant who had forgotten how to be gentle. But in the quiet of the library, with Elena's warmth pressed against him, he realized that perhaps he hadn't grown too big. He had just been waiting for someone with a heart large enough to hold him. As he finally pulled away, his eyes lingered on hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "There are things in this house you haven't seen yet, Elena, secrets that even I've tried to bury. If you're going to stay, you need to know who you're really standing next to." He turned and walked toward a hidden panel in the bookshelf, his hand hovering over a specific volume. Eleanor watched, her breath held, as the shadows of the past began to stir in the corners of the room, ready to reveal the secrets that would change everything she thought she knew about Arthur Thorne. The hidden panel slid open with a whisper of ancient hinges, revealing a small velvet-lined alcove that seemed to hold the very breath of the house. Inside, there were no ledgers of blood money or blueprints for conquest. Instead, there was a single silver frame, tarnished by time and the salt of unshed tears. Arthur reached in, his large hand trembling almost imperceptibly as he withdrew the photograph. It was November 22nd, 1997, but as Arthur looked at the image, he was transported back to October 12th, 1995. "She was the only thing that didn't belong to the streets," Arthur whispered, his voice so thick with grief it sounded like a physical weight. He handed the frame to Eleanor. In the photograph, a woman with hair like spun silk and a smile that could have lit up the darkest corners of London stood beside a younger, less scarred Arthur. They were laughing, The city skyline blurred behind them. It was a picture of a man who still believed in the possibility of peace. Her name was Clara, Elena said softly, her thumb tracing the edge of the silver frame. She didn't need to ask what happened. The silence in the room, the way Arthur's jaw was set like granite, told the story of a light extinguished too soon. They didn't mean to hit her, Arthur said, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. They wanted me. They wanted to show the giant that he could bleed. I had just finished my first major acquisition of the northern docks. I was feeling invincible, too big to be touched. He let out a harsh, jagged laugh. I was in the car with her. The bullet was meant for my head. It took hers instead. Eleanor felt a cold wave of horror wash over her, followed immediately by a fierce protective warmth for the man standing before her. She set the photograph on the mahogany desk and stepped toward him. The library felt smaller now, the shadows pressing in, leaving only the two of them in a circle of amber light. "You carry that every day," she whispered. "Every time you look at Rose, every time you close your eyes." "I carry it so I never forget what happens when I let my guard down," Arthur replied, turning to face her. He looked older in this light, the weight of his empire finally showing in the slump of his shoulders. "That's why I'm too big, Elena. Because if I'm not the biggest thing in the room, I'm the target. And if I'm the target, the people I love pay the price." He reached out, his hand hovering over her shoulder before finally descending. His fingers were heavy, anchoring her to the spot. He pulled her closer, his proximity a dizzying mix of cedarwood, expensive tobacco, and the raw electric heat of his skin. Eleanor didn't pull away. She leaned into him, her hands finding the small of his back, feeling the tension in his muscles. "You're not alone anymore, Arthur," she said, her voice muffled against the crisp cotton of his shirt. "You don't have to be a giant every second of the day." Arthur let out a sound that was halfway between a groan and a sigh. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her flush against his massive frame. The height difference was so pronounced that her face was buried in the center of his chest, her ears filled with the rhythmic, powerful thud of his heart. She could feel the hard planes of his chest, the strength that could crush a man and yet was currently holding her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. He shifted his grip, his hands sliding up her back to cradle the back of her head. He tilted her face up, forcing her to look at the raw hunger and the deep-seated pain in his dark eyes. The air between them was saturated with a sudden, unbearable sensuality. Every breath he took was an invitation. Every blink of her eyes was a surrender. "You are so young," he murmured, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her jaw. "So untouched by this filth. I should send you away right now. I should throw you out of those gates and lock them behind you. But you won't," Elena countered, her breath hitching as his thumb moved to her lower lip, pressing down slightly to reveal the pink dampness of her mouth. "No," he whispered, his voice dropping to a seductive growl. "I won't. I'm a selfish man, Elena. I've spent my life taking what I want, and right now I want to keep you in this house until the world outside forgets you ever existed." He leaned down, his lips grazing the shell of her ear, sending a shiver of pure fire down her spine. His hand slid down from her head, his fingers splaying across her throat, feeling the frantic rhythmic pulse of her desire. The contact was electric, a bridge between his dark world and her light. Elena's hands moved up to his neck, her fingers tangling in the short, dark hair at the nape. She pulled him closer, her body molding itself to his with an urgency she hadn't known she possessed. "I'm not afraid of being forgotten," she whispered against his neck. "I'm only afraid of you being alone." Arthur's grip tightened, his body reacting to her words with a surge of possessive heat. He pressed his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. For a long moment, they simply stood there, two souls colliding in the wreckage of a tragic past and the uncertainty of a dangerous future. The physical proximity was overwhelming, a tidal wave of sensation that threatened to pull them both under. Finally, Arthur pulled back just enough to look at her. His expression had shifted from grief to a cold, focused determination. "There is a gala next week, the 14th of December. It's a high society masquerade, a front for the families to discuss the new distribution routes. I need to be there. I need to show them that Arthur Thorne is still the biggest player in the city." "And you want me to go," Elena said, sensing the shift in the air. "I need you to go," he corrected, his voice firm. "But not as the nanny. You will go as my companion. We will show them that I have found a new strength. But be warned, Elena, once we walk through those doors together, there is no going back to the nursery. You will be part of my world, in the eyes of every friend and every enemy I have." Elena looked at the photograph of Clara one last time, then back at Arthur. She saw the man who had been broken by the streets and rebuilt by his own will. She saw the danger, the blood, and the power. And then she saw the way his hand was still resting on her waist, as if he were afraid she would vanish if he let go. "I'll get my dress ready," she said, her voice steady and full of a quiet, burning resolve. Arthur nodded, his eyes dark with a mixture of pride and a looming protective dread. As she turned to leave the library, he watched the sway of her hips, the grace of her movements, and the way the light caught the dark silk of her hair. He knew he was leading her into a den of vipers, but as he closed the hidden panel on his past, he realized that for the first time since October 12th, 1995, he wasn't looking behind him. He was looking at the woman who had promised she could handle the giant, and he was beginning to believe she might be right. The shadows in the library seemed to retreat as he stood there, the silence no longer heavy with grief, but vibrating with anticipation. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the frost and preparing the city for the storm that was coming. The gala was only 7 days away, and in those 7 days, the rules of the Thorne estate would be rewritten in the language of desire and survival. The evening of December 14th, 1997, was draped in a thick, sulphurous fog that clung to the street lamps of Mayfair like a damp shroud. Outside the grand townhouse of Lord Stirling, a man whose noble title was a thin veil for his role as a money launderer for the city's most dangerous men, a line of black sedans stretched like a funeral procession. Inside the Thorne estate, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. Elena stood before the full-length mirror in her quarters, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The dress Arthur had provided was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk, its plunging neckline held together by a single sapphire brooch that cost more than her father had earned in 20 years. The fabric clung to her curves like a second skin, the silk whispering against her thighs with every breath. Her hair was swept up into a sophisticated crown of braids, leaving her neck bare, a pale, vulnerable expanse of skin. A heavy knock echoed through the room. Arthur stepped inside, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked truly lethal. He was dressed in a black tuxedo that emphasized the terrifying breadth of his shoulders. A mask of matte black leather rested in his hand, its sharp features mimicking the coldness of his own. "You look—" Arthur started, his voice catching in a way she had never heard. He walked toward her, his heavy footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He stopped inches away, his physical presence acting like a magnet, pulling the air from her lungs. "You look like a dream I don't deserve to have." "Is that a warning, Arthur?" Elena asked, her voice a soft, melodic contrast to the weight of his presence. He reached out, his large, scarred hand hovering over her bare shoulder. The heat radiating from his palm was a physical force. When he finally made contact, his thumb grazing the sensitive skin at the base of her neck, Elena felt a jolt of electricity that made her toes curl. He leaned in, his lips inches from her ear, the scent of expensive cologne and old-fashioned masculinity enveloping her. "The men tonight are wolves, Elena. They will smell the innocence on you, and they will try to use it to get to me. Stay close. If I move, you move. If I speak, you watch. Do you understand?" "I'm not afraid of wolves," she whispered, turning in his arms so she could look him in the eye. "I've spent every day with a lion." Arthur's gaze darkened, a slow burning hunger flickering in the depths of his eyes. He tightened his grip on her shoulder, his fingers pressing into her skin with a possessiveness that was both terrifying and intoxicating. He didn't kiss her, but the way he looked at her mouth was an act of intimacy that left her breathless. "Let's go," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "It's time to show them that I've grown far too big to be ignored." The gala was a whirlwind of oppressive elegance. The grand ballroom was filled with the scent of lilies, expensive tobacco, and the metallic tang of hidden agendas. Men in masks huddled in corners, their whispers like the dry rustle of dead leaves. Elena felt the weight of 100 stares as she walked through the doors on Arthur's arm. She was the only thing in the room that wasn't covered in a layer of cynical dust. "Look at that," a voice drawled from the crowd. "Thorne has brought a pet, a little lamb for the slaughterhouse." It was Julian Vane, a rival whose family had controlled the northern transport routes for generations, the very routes Arthur was currently dismantling. He stepped forward, his mask a grotesque golden skull. Beside him stood a woman draped in diamonds, her eyes narrowed with a sharp feminine jealousy as they swept over Elena. "She's a bit young for you, isn't she, Artie?" Julian continued, his voice carrying through the sudden silence of the room. "Or is she just the latest distraction from the fact that your empire is leaking from the seams?" Arthur didn't flinch. He stood like a monolith of dark stone, his hand resting on the small of Elena's back. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the raw power held back by a thin thread of civilized restraint. "Julian," Arthur said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "you always did have a habit of talking when you should be listening. It's a trait that usually leads to a very short career." The woman beside Julian let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Is it true, dear, that you're just the nanny? I hear you spend your days cleaning up after his brat. It's a pity. You're almost pretty enough to be someone important." Eleanor felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, but she didn't look away. She remembered the weight of Arthur's hand on her jaw in the library, the way he had looked at her, as if she were the only thing that mattered in a world of shadows. She felt a sudden, fierce surge of protectiveness for the man standing beside her. "I care for his daughter," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "And I see the man behind the mask. Something tells me you haven't seen a real man in a very long time." The room went silent. Julian's golden mask seemed to glitter with a cold, metallic rage. He stepped toward Elena, his hand reaching out as if to touch the sapphire brooch at her neckline. Before he could get close, Arthur's hand shot out. He didn't punch him. He simply caught Julian's wrist in a grip that looked effortless, but made the other man's face pale with sudden, agonizing pain. Arthur leaned in, his voice a whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. "If you ever think about touching her again, Julian, I will make sure the only thing your family has left to transport is your coffin. Do we have an understanding?" Julian's breath hitched, his knees buckling slightly under the pressure. He nodded frantically, and Arthur let go, brushing his hand against his tuxedo as if he had just touched something filthy. "The air is getting thin in here," Arthur said, turning back to Elena. He didn't wait for a response. He led her toward the balcony, the heavy velvet curtains closing behind them and muffling the sounds of the gala. The cold London air hit them, a welcome relief from the stifling heat of the ballroom. Arthur walked to the stone railing, his hands clenched so tightly the knuckles were white. Eleanor walked up behind him, her hands coming up to rest on his broad back. She could feel the heat of his body through the fabric, the raw, vibrating energy of his anger. "I shouldn't have brought you," he growled, his back still turned. "I exposed you to that filth." "You didn't expose me," she said, moving around to face him. "You showed me who they are, and you showed them who I am." Arthur looked at her then, his expression a mixture of pride and a looming, dark obsession. He reached out, his hand sliding into her hair, pulling her head back until she was forced to look at the storm in his eyes. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "You are too good for this world, Elena, too pure, and yet I can't let you go. I've grown too big, and you're the only thing that keeps me grounded. I want to hide you. I want to keep you in the dark, where no one can ever look at you like that again." He shifted his grip, his hand moving down to her waist, pulling her flush against him. The physical contact was overwhelming, the midnight blue silk of her dress sliding against the rough wool of his tuxedo. Elena could feel every hard line of his body, the strength that was both a shield and a prison. She reached up, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw, feeling the stubble beneath the skin. "Then keep me," she whispered, her breath hitching as his hand moved lower, his fingers splaying across her hip with a slow, deliberate pressure that made her blood hum. "But don't keep me in the dark, Arthur. Let me be the light that shows you the way out." Arthur let out a sound that was half growl, half sob, He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot against her skin. The vulnerability of the too big gangster was on full display in the shadows of the balcony, a secret shared only with the girl who had promised to handle him. But as they stood there, wrapped in a sensual, desperate embrace, a shadow moved in the gardens below. A flash of light caught the barrel of a lens, and a silent observer vanished into the fog. The whispers of the gala were nothing compared to the secrets that were about to be revealed, and as the clock struck midnight, the first cracks in the Thorn Empire began to show in places Arthur had never thought to look. The drive back to the estate on the early morning of December 15th, 1997, was conducted in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical presence between them. The dark interior of the sedan was illuminated only by the intermittent sweep of orange street lamps as they tore through the London fog. Arthur sat with his jaw clenched, his large frame occupying nearly 2/3 of the leather bench seat. Beside him, Elena felt the vibration of the engine through the floorboards, but it was the vibration of the man next to her that truly commanded her attention. When the iron gates finally groaned shut behind them and the car came to a halt in the gravel driveway, Arthur didn't wait for the driver. He stepped out and held the door for Elena, his hand steady, but his eyes burning with a dark, unresolved energy. Inside the house the air was still and smelled of extinguished beeswax and cold stone. The servants were long asleep, leaving the grand foyer to the shadows. Arthur stripped off his tuxedo jacket and threw it onto a marble bench, his white shirt glowing in the dim light. He looked at Elena, who was still draped in the midnight blue silk, her sapphire brooch glinting like a lonely star. "You should go to bed," Arthur said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "I don't think I can sleep," Elena replied. She walked toward him, her heels clicking softly on the checkerboard floor. She stopped just outside the circle of his heat. "The way you looked at that man, Julian, you looked like you wanted to tear the world apart." Arthur let out a sharp, mirthless sound. He turned away, pacing the small space of the foyer like a beast in a cage that was suddenly far too small. "I am a man of violence, Elena. You saw a glimpse of the reality tonight. That wasn't a performance. That is who I am when the masks come off. I am too big for this house, too big for a quiet life, and certainly too dangerous for someone like you." He stopped his pacing and turned back to her, his chest heaving under the thin cotton of his shirt. He looked down at his own hands, large, scarred, and capable of ending a life with terrifying efficiency. "Look at me. I'm a monster that has grown so large, I don't even recognize my own reflection anymore. My world is full of blood and debt. You're a girl who smells like lavender and still believes in the goodness of people. It's a mismatch that will only end in your destruction." Elena didn't retreat. Instead, she took the final 2 steps that separated them. She reached out, her small, pale hand coming to rest on his forearm. The skin was hot, the muscles beneath it corded like steel cables. She felt the slight tremor in him, not of fear, but of a man holding back an avalanche. "You keep warning me about how big you are, Arthur," she whispered, her voice a soft, steady anchor in the darkness. "You keep telling me you're too much to handle. But you're forgetting one thing." "And what's that?" he growled, his gaze dropping to her hand on his arm. "I'm the one who handles the things no one else wants to touch," she said. She slid her hand up his arm, her fingers grazing the underside of his bicep, feeling the raw masculine power of him. "I handle the silence in this house. I handle your daughter's grief, and I can handle you." Arthur let out a low groan, a sound of pure, frustrated desire. He grabbed her waist, his large hands nearly meeting around her middle, and hoisted her upward until she was pinned against the cold stone wall of the foyer. The silk of her dress bunched between them, the friction of the fabric creating a static charge that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. Elena wrapped her legs around his waist instinctively, her hands finding the back of his neck. She could feel the hard planes of his chest pressing into her breasts, the heat of his body radiating through her like a fever. He was massive, a literal giant of a man, and the way he held her made her feel both entirely safe and dangerously exposed. "You have no idea," he muttered against the skin of her throat. His breath was hot and smelled of the single malt scotch he'd had at the gala. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his lips grazing the sensitive skin just below her ear. "I could crush you without even trying. I could take everything you are and leave nothing behind but the memory of a girl who was too brave for her own good." "Then do it," she challenged him, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Show me the monster, Arthur, because all I see is a man who is starving for a touch that isn't transactional." Arthur's grip tightened, his fingers splaying across her hips with a slow, deliberate pressure that made her blood hum with a sudden, violent need. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes dark with a hunger that was almost frightening. He ran his thumb across her lower lip, pulling it down to reveal the damp pink of the inside. The contrast between his dark, scarred skin and her porcelain features was a visual testament to the collision of their worlds. He leaned in, his lips hovering a fraction of an inch from hers. He didn't kiss her, not yet. He let the tension build until it was a physical weight, a hand on the flame that refused to be extinguished. He moved his hand from her hip, his fingers sliding up the side of her ribcage, tracing the curve of her breast through the silk. It was an intimate, possessive gesture that claimed every inch of her. "I'm too big, Elena," he whispered again, his voice vibrating against her lips. "Too heavy, too dark." "I can handle it," she whispered back, her fingers tangling in his hair and pulling him that final agonizing inch. The kiss wasn't gentle, it was a collision of two desperate forces. Arthur tasted of smoke and silver, his tongue demanding entry with a dominance that left her weak. He shifted his weight, pressing her harder against the wall, his massive frame completely enveloping her. Elena felt the raw strength of his thighs against hers, the uncompromising reality of his desire. It was a sensory overload, the smell of his skin, the taste of his mouth, the feeling of his heavy hands exploring the curves of her body. Just as the heat threatened to consume them both, a sharp, repetitive sound cut through the haze. Clack, clack, clack. The sound of a heavy brass knocker hitting the front door. Arthur froze. His eyes snapped open, the haze of lust replaced instantly by the cold, sharp focus of a predator. He didn't let Elena down immediately. He held her for a heartbeat longer, his chest heaving, before slowly sliding her down until her feet touched the marble. He stepped back, smoothing his shirt with a hand that was now perfectly steady. The giant was back behind the mask. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice cold. He walked to the door and pulled it open. Standing on the steps, drenched in rain and looking pale as a ghost, was Marcus, Arthur's youngest associate, and a man he treated almost like a son. Marcus's shirt was torn at the collar, and his hands were stained with something dark that couldn't have been mud. "Artie," Marcus wheezed, his eyes darting to Elena in the shadows before returning to Arthur. "It's Lenny. They found him in the warehouse. He's gone, Artie." And he wasn't alone when they did it. Someone let them in. The temperature in the foyer seemed to drop 20 degrees. Arthur didn't move, but Elena saw the way his shoulders set, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. The too big empire was bleeding, and the poison was coming from the inside. "Go to the nursery, Elena," Arthur said, not looking back at her. His voice held no trace of the heat they had shared moments ago. It was the voice of a man preparing for war. "Lock the door. Do not come out until I tell you." As Marcus stepped into the house, bringing the scent of rain and copper with him, Eleanor watched the two men retreat into the study. The loop was opening. The betrayal had been named. The sensuality of the night was dead, buried under the weight of a new, lethal reality. Arthur Thorne had been warned he was too big, and now someone was trying to cut him down to size by starting with the people he trusted most. The drive back to the estate on the early morning of December 15th, 1997, was conducted in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical presence between them. The dark interior of the sedan was illuminated only by the intermittent sweep of orange street lamps as they tore through the London fog. Arthur sat with his jaw clenched, his large frame occupying nearly 2/3 of the leather bench seat. Beside him, Eleanor felt the vibration of the engine through the floorboards, but it was the vibration of the man next to her that truly commanded her attention. When the iron gates finally groaned shut behind them and the car came to a halt in the gravel driveway, Arthur didn't wait for the driver. He stepped out and held the door for Elena, his hand steady but his eyes burning with a dark, unresolved energy. Inside the house, the air was still and smelled of extinguished beeswax and cold stone. The servants were long asleep, leaving the grand foyer to the shadows. Arthur stripped off his tuxedo jacket and threw it onto a marble bench, his white shirt glowing in the dim light. He looked at Eleanor, who was still draped in the midnight blue silk, her sapphire brooch glinting like a lonely star. "You should go to bed," Arthur said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "I don't think I can sleep," Elena replied. She walked toward him, her heels clicking softly on the checkerboard floor. She stopped just outside the circle of his heat. "The way you looked at that man, Julian, you looked like you wanted to tear the world apart." Arthur let out a sharp, mirthless sound. He turned away, pacing the small space of the foyer like a beast in a cage that was suddenly far too small. "I am a man of violence, Elena. You saw a glimpse of the reality tonight. That wasn't a performance. That is who I am when the masks come off. I am too big for this house, too big for a quiet life, and certainly too dangerous for someone like you." He stopped his pacing and turned back to her, his chest heaving under the thin cotton of his shirt. He looked down at his own hands, large, scarred, and capable of ending a life with terrifying efficiency. "Look at me. I'm a monster that has grown so large I don't even recognize my own reflection anymore. My world is full of blood and debt. You're a girl who smells like lavender and still believes in the goodness of people. It's a mismatch that will only end in your destruction." Eleanor didn't retreat. Instead, she took the final 2 steps that separated them. She reached out, her small, pale hand coming to rest on his forearm. The skin was hot, the muscles beneath it corded like steel cables. She felt the slight tremor in him, not of fear, but of a man holding back an avalanche. "You keep warning me about how big you are, Arthur," she whispered, her voice a soft, steady anchor in the darkness. "You keep telling me you're too much to handle, but you're forgetting one thing." "And what's that?" he growled, his gaze dropping to her hand on his arm. "I'm the one who handles the things no one else wants to touch," she said. She slid her hand up his arm, her fingers grazing the underside of his bicep, feeling the raw, masculine power of him. "I handle the silence in this house. I handle your daughter's grief, and I can handle you." Arthur let out a low groan, a sound of pure, frustrated desire. He grabbed her waist, his large hands nearly meeting around her middle, and hoisted her upward until she was pinned against the cold stone wall of the foyer. The silk of her dress bunched between them, the friction of the fabric creating a static charge that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. Eleanor wrapped her legs around his waist instinctively, her hands finding the back of his neck. She could feel the hard planes of his chest pressing into her breasts, the heat of his body radiating through her like a fever. He was massive, a literal giant of a man, and the way he held her made her feel both entirely safe and dangerously exposed. "You have no idea," he muttered against the skin of her throat. His breath was hot and smelled of the single malt scotch he'd had at the gala. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his lips grazing the sensitive skin just below her ear. "I could crush you without even trying. I could take everything you are and leave nothing behind but the memory of a girl who was too brave for her own good." "Then do it," she challenged him, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Show me the monster, Arthur, because all I see is a man who is starving for a touch that isn't transactional." Arthur's grip tightened, his fingers splaying across her hips with a slow, deliberate pressure that made her blood hum with a sudden, violent need. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes dark with a hunger that was almost frightening. He ran his thumb across her lower lip, pulling it down to reveal the damp pink of the inside. The contrast between his dark, scarred skin and her porcelain features was a visual testament to the collision of their worlds. He leaned in, his lips hovering a fraction of an inch from hers. He didn't kiss her, not yet. He let the tension build until it was a physical weight, a hand on the flame that refused to be extinguished. He moved his hand from her hip, his fingers sliding up the side of her ribcage, tracing the curve of her breast through the silk. It was an intimate, possessive gesture that claimed every inch of her. "I'm too big, Elena," he whispered again, his voice vibrating against her lips. "Too heavy, too dark." "I can handle it," she whispered back, her fingers tangling in his hair and pulling him that final agonizing inch. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was a collision of two desperate forces. Arthur tasted of smoke and silver, his tongue demanding entry with a dominance that left her weak. He shifted his weight, pressing her harder against the wall, his massive frame completely enveloping her. Elena felt the raw strength of his thighs against hers, the uncompromising reality of his desire. It was a sensory overload, the smell of his skin, the taste of his mouth, the feeling of his heavy hands exploring the curves of her body. Just as the heat threatened to consume them both, a sharp, repetitive sound cut through the haze. Clack, clack, clack. The sound of a heavy brass knocker hitting the front door. Arthur froze. His eyes snapped open, the haze of lust replaced instantly by the cold, sharp focus of a predator. He didn't let Elena down immediately. He held her for a heartbeat longer, his chest heaving, before slowly sliding her down until her feet touched the marble. He stepped back, smoothing his shirt with a hand that was now perfectly steady. The giant was back behind the mask. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice cold. He walked to the door and pulled it open. Standing on the steps, drenched in rain and looking pale as a ghost, was Marcus, Arthur's youngest associate, and a man he treated almost like a son. Marcus's shirt was torn at the collar, and his hands were stained with something dark that couldn't have been mud. "Artie," Marcus wheezed, his eyes darting to Elena in the shadows before returning to Arthur. "It's Lenny. They found him in the warehouse. He's gone, Artie." And he wasn't alone when they did it. Someone let them in. The temperature in the foyer seemed to drop 20 degrees. Arthur didn't move, but Elena saw the way his shoulders set, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides. The too-big empire was bleeding, and the poison was coming from the inside. "Go to the nursery, Elena," Arthur said, not looking back at her. His voice held no trace of the heat they had shared moments ago. It was the voice of a man preparing for war. "Lock the door. Do not come out until I tell you." As Marcus stepped into the house, bringing the scent of rain and copper with him, Eleanor watched the two men retreat into the study. The loop was opening. The betrayal had been named. The sensuality of the night was dead, buried under the weight of a new, lethal reality. Arthur Thorne had been warned he was too big, and now someone was trying to cut him down to size by starting with the people he trusted most. The dawn of December 16th, 1997, offered no light, only a bruised purple smear across the horizon that seemed to bleed into the grey stone of the estate. The air inside the house had changed. The quiet was no longer peaceful, but predatory. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a footstep, and every shadow seemed to hide a blade. Arthur had not slept. He sat in his study, the air thick with the smell of stale tobacco and the copper tang of the blood Marcus had brought in on his sleeves. Elena watched from the doorway. She had ignored his command to stay in the nursery. In a world where everyone was looking for a way to cut the giant down to size, she realized that being his shadow was the only way to keep him whole. She carried a tray with a pot of black coffee and 2 slices of dry toast, though she knew he wouldn't eat. "I told you to stay behind locked doors," Arthur said without looking up. His voice was a wreckage of gravel and exhaustion. He was hunched over his desk, surrounded by files, ledgers, and a single, crumpled pack of cigarettes. The white shirt he had worn to the gala was now wrinkled, the top 3 buttons undone to reveal the dark hair on his chest and the silver chain of a medallion he never spoke of. "The doors are locked, Arthur." "But I am not a prisoner," Elena replied softly. She walked into the room, her bare feet silent on the rug. She set the tray on the edge of the desk, pushing aside a map of the London docks to make room. Arthur finally looked at her. His eyes were bloodshot, the dark circles beneath them making him look like a man who had already seen his own ghost. He looked at her pale face, her hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders, and for a moment the iron mask slipped. He looked small, not in stature, but in spirit. "Lenny was with me since the beginning," Arthur whispered, his hand reaching for the coffee but stopping halfway. "He was the one who drove the getaway car in '92 when the Southside gang tried to corner us. He took a bullet in the shoulder for me. And now he's on a cold slab because someone inside this house decided a few £1,000 was worth more than a decade of loyalty. "It's not about the money, is it?" Elena asked, leaning against the desk. She was close enough to feel the heat radiating from his massive body, a heat that felt like a dying star. "They're trying to prove the warning right. They want you to feel that you've grown too big to see the snakes at your feet." Arthur let out a harsh, dry laugh. He reached out and grabbed her wrist, his grip firm but not painful. He pulled her closer until she was standing between his knees. The physical contact was immediate and grounding. Elena felt the vibration of his breathing against her thighs. "I look at Silas and I see a man who wants my chair," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a seductive, dangerous whisper. "I look at Victor, and I see a man who thinks I've grown soft because of this house. I look at Marcus, and I see a boy who is too scared to tell me the truth. I trust no one, Eleanor. Not a single soul in this city." "You trust me," she said, her fingers finding their way into the thick, dark hair at the nape of his neck. She began to massage the tension there, her touch a stark contrast to the violence he had been contemplating all night. Arthur closed his eyes, his head dropping forward until his forehead rested against her stomach. He let out a long, ragged breath that warmed her skin through the thin fabric of her nightgown. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, a giant seeking solace in the only thing that didn't want anything from him. "Why?" he muttered against her skin. "Why do I trust a girl who doesn't even know how to hold a gun? A girl who should be miles away from a man like me?" "Because I'm the only one who isn't afraid to tell you when you're being a fool," she whispered back. She felt his hands slide up her back, his large palms splaying across her shoulder blades. The weight of him was immense, a physical manifestation of the empire he carried. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands sliding down to her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. The sensuality of the moment was thick and heavy, like the London fog outside. Elena could feel the hard lines of his body, the uncompromising strength that made him the king of the underground. She leaned down, her lips grazing his forehead, then his temple, before lingering near his ear. "You're not too big to be loved, Arthur," she breathed. "You're just too big for people who don't have enough room in their hearts for you." Arthur's grip tightened, his fingers digging into the soft flesh of her hips. He let out a low growl of desire and frustration, his mouth finding the sensitive skin of her neck. He bit down gently, a possessive mark that made Elena's knees buckle. He caught her, his arms wrapping around her like iron bands, holding her suspended in the space between his world and hers. The physical heat between them was a distraction from the cold reality of the betrayal, a fire that burned away the paranoia for a few precious seconds. He moved his hand from her waist, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw before pressing against her lower lip. He looked at her with a hunger that was almost frightening, a need that went beyond the physical. "If I find out who did it," Arthur said, his voice thick with a new kind of intensity, "I will have to be the man you saw at the gala. I will have to be the monster. Can you handle that, Elena? Can you handle the blood on my hands when I come back to you?" "I'll wash it off," she replied, her voice steady and full of a quiet, burning resolve. Arthur didn't kiss her then, though the air between them was saturated with the promise of it. He let her go, stepping back as if the contact were a drug he was trying to quit. He turned back to the desk and picked up a single gold-plated lighter that had been left in the warehouse where Lenny was found. It wasn't Arthur's. It wasn't Marcus's. "This belonged to an associate of the Italians," Arthur said, his eyes narrowing as he flipped the lid open and shut. Click, clack, click. "But the Italians haven't been north of the river in 3 years. Someone invited them in. Someone gave them the keys to my kingdom." He walked to the window, the grey light of morning finally revealing the exhaustion on his face. Lenny was supposed to meet someone last night, someone he trusted. He told Marcus he was going to settle a debt with a friend. "Who?" Eleanor asked. Arthur turned to her, his expression hardening into a mask of cold, lethal calculation. He didn't say, but he left a note in his locker at the docks, a single name written on a scrap of paper. Eleanor felt a cold chill run down her spine. The loop was tightening. The name wasn't a stranger's, it was someone who had sat at Arthur's table, someone who had toasted to his health while planning his demise. "Arthur," she started, but he held up a hand. "Go back to the nursery, Eleanor. The sun is up and the world is watching." From this moment on, you are the only one who knows that I know. To the rest of them, I am just a grieving boss looking for a ghost. But you are my eyes. Watch the men when they come today. Watch Silas, watch Victor. Watch the way they look at you when they think I'm not looking. I'll watch, she promised. As she walked out of the study, the sound of the brass lighter clicking shut followed her down the hall. The house was waking up, but the people inside were more like ghosts than ever. The betrayal had a face now, even if Arthur wasn't ready to name it out loud. And as Elena reached the nursery, she saw a shadow move at the end of the hallway. A shadow that shouldn't have been there, watching the door to the master's inner sanctum with a quiet, hungry patience. The morning of December 17th, 1997, felt like the world was being smothered in a grey woolen blanket. A biting wind whipped off the Thames, carrying the scent of salt and industrial grease into the heart of the city. Inside the Thorne estate, the silence was no longer heavy with anticipation. It was sharp with the sting of defeat. By 10 in the morning, Arthur had received 3 phone calls that had effectively decapitated his financial reach. His offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands had been flagged for an audit that would take months to resolve. 2 of his primary shipping containers at the Tilbury docks, filled with high-end electronics, meant for the black market, had been seized by customs and excise. To make matters worse, the union leaders he had kept on a short leash for 15 years had suddenly stopped answering his calls. Arthur sat in his study, the room lit only by the dying embers in the fireplace. He looked like a king whose throne was being dismantled while he still sat upon it. He was 34 years old, but in this light he looked like a man who had lived 100 years of violence in a single night. Elena entered without knocking. She had seen Silas leaving the house 20 minutes earlier, a smug, satisfied tilt to his shoulders that made her skin crawl. She didn't bring coffee this time. She brought herself. "They're hitting you where it hurts, aren't they?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Arthur didn't look up from the ledger in front of him. "They're not just hitting me, Elena. They're erasing me. Someone has whispered the right words into the right ears. My assets are being frozen, my men are being squeezed, and the city I built is turning into a ghost town." He finally looked at her, and the intensity of his gaze was enough to make her breath hitch. "I've grown too big, just like they said. And when you're this big, you don't just fall, you collapse. And I won't have you and Rose caught in the rubble." "What are you saying?" Elena walked toward him, her simple grey dress swaying around her legs. "I've arranged for a car," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative rumble. "Tomorrow morning, December 18th, you and Rose will be taken to a safe house in the countryside. It's a small cottage near the coast. No one knows I own it. You'll have enough money to live comfortably for years. Once I've cleared this mess, if I clear it, I'll come for you." Elena stopped inches from his desk. "No." Arthur stood up, his massive frame casting a long, intimidating shadow across the room. He rounded the desk, his movements heavy and deliberate. He stopped so close to her that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "This isn't a request, Elena, it's an order. My enemies are closing in. They know you're my weakness. They've seen the way I look at you. They'll use you to get to me, and I won't let that happen." "You think I'm a weakness?" Elena countered, her head tilting back so she could meet his dark, turbulent eyes. "I'm the only thing in this house that isn't falling apart, Arthur. If you send me away, you're not protecting me. You're giving up on the only part of your life that's still real." Arthur's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He reached out, his large, calloused hands grabbing her upper arms. He didn't pull her closer. He held her at a distance, as if trying to convince himself that he could survive without her touch. "You don't understand the price of this crown," he growled. "I've spent half my life making people afraid of me so they wouldn't hurt the people I care about. But it backfired. The bigger I got, the more people wanted to see me fail. And right now, the most dangerous thing you can be is the woman who belongs to Arthur Thorne." "Then let me be dangerous," Elena whispered. She stepped into his space, her body pressing against his. The physical contact was like a match to dry tinder. She could feel the hard planes of his chest, the uncompromising strength of his thighs, and the frantic, heavy thud of his heart. She reached up, her fingers splaying across his chest, feeling the heat of him through the thin cotton of his shirt. "I told you I could handle you. I didn't say I could only handle you when things were easy. If the walls are coming down, I want to be inside them with you." Arthur let out a low, tortured groan. He let go of her arms and wrapped them around her waist, pulling her flush against him with a sudden, violent possessiveness. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot and ragged against her skin. Elena felt the raw, masculine power of him, the way his body seemed to hum with a desperate, unspoken need. He shifted his grip, his hands sliding down to the small of her back, his fingers pressing into her skin with a slow, sensual pressure that made her knees weak. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes dark with a mixture of hunger and a looming protective dread. He ran his thumb across her lower lip, his gaze dropping to her mouth. "You're a fool, Elena," he whispered, his voice vibrating against her lips. "A beautiful, brave fool. And you're a giant who's forgotten that even the biggest man needs a place to hide," she breathed back. He didn't wait any longer. He crushed his mouth against hers in a kiss that was both a reclamation and a surrender. It tasted of desperation and salt, a collision of two worlds that should never have met. Arthur's hands moved with a feverish intensity, one sliding up to cradle the back of her head, the other molding her hip to his. The physical proximity was overwhelming, a tidal wave of sensation that threatened to wash away the fear of the morning. Elena tangled her fingers in his hair, pulling him closer, her body arching into his. She felt the uncompromising reality of his desire, the way his large frame completely enveloped her, making her feel small yet incredibly powerful. In this moment, the frozen accounts and the seized containers didn't matter. There was only the heat of his skin, the smell of his tobacco-stained breath, and the way his hands made her feel like she was the only thing in the world that was solid. When he finally pulled away, his forehead rested against hers. They were both breathless, the air between them thick with a new, dangerous understanding. "If you stay," Arthur said, his voice a low, jagged rasp, "there is no going back. The car is cancelled. But you must understand. The siege is coming. They've taken my money. Next they'll come for my blood. Then we'll give them a fight they'll never forget," Elena replied, her eyes burning with a quiet, fierce resolve. Arthur looked at her, and for the first time in 3 days, a small, dark smile touched his lips. He reached out and traced the line of her sapphire brooch, the jewel he had given her for the gala. "I was warned I was too big for my own good, but perhaps I'm just big enough to hold on to the only thing that matters." He walked back to his desk, but he didn't pick up the ledger. He picked up a heavy black telephone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Marcus," Arthur said when the line connected, "tell the men to assemble at the warehouse. We're not retreating. We're cutting the snakes out of the grass. And Marcus, bring the heavy crates, the ones we haven't touched since '94. He hung up the phone and looked at Elena. The transformation was complete. The grieving, paranoid boss was gone. In his place was the general who had conquered the city. "The price of the crown is blood, Elena," Arthur said, his voice cold and focused. "And tonight, we start paying it." As she walked out of the room to check on Rose, Elena felt the shift in the house. The windows were being shuttered, the gates were being reinforced, and the men in dark coats were no longer standing guard. They were preparing for a siege. The loop was closing. The betrayal was about to be met with a vengeance that would shake the foundations of London. Arthur Thorne had been pushed into a corner, and the people who had put him there were about to realize that a giant is most dangerous when he has something to lose. By the evening of December 19th, 1997, the Thorne estate had transformed from a residence into a tomb of iron and silence. Outside, the fog had thickened into a yellow-grey soup that swallowed the street lamps, but inside time had ceased to exist. Every window on the ground floor had been reinforced with steel shutters, and the only light came from the flickering orange glow of the fireplaces and the occasional dim bulb in the hallways. 3 days of isolation had stripped away the formalities of the household. Arthur's army of men was stationed at the perimeter, invisible in the mist, leaving the interior of the house to Arthur, Elena, and Rose. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer and the distant muffled sound of the city that seemed to be forgetting they existed. Arthur was a shadow in his own halls. He moved with a heavy, restless energy. His presence felt even when he wasn't in the room. He had barely slept, his eyes now permanently rimmed with the red fatigue of a man waiting for a blow he knew was coming. Elena found him in the library late that night. It was the only room where the heat seemed to linger. She had spent the day keeping Rose calm, playing games in a world where the sun never rose, but now the child was finally asleep. Elena wore a simple silk robe over her nightgown, the fabric soft against her skin, a stark contrast to the cold stone of the walls. Arthur was standing by the fireplace, his shirt discarded, revealing the brutal map of his life etched into his skin. There were 3 distinct bullet scars on his left shoulder and a jagged line across his ribs that spoke of a knife fight in his youth. He looked like a statue of a fallen god, the muscles of his back rippling as he stoked the embers. "The silence is the worst part," Arthur said without turning around. His voice was a low, tired rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "It's the sound of the world deciding whether you're worth saving, or the sound of you finally having a moment to breathe," Elena replied. She walked toward him, her footsteps swallowed by the thick Persian rug. The heat from the fire hit her, but it was the heat coming off Arthur that drew her in. He turned to face her, and the intensity of his gaze was a physical weight. He looked at her, at the way the silk clung to the curves of her hips and the way her hair fell in dark, messy waves over her shoulders. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air before his fingers finally brushed against her cheek. His skin was rough, calloused, and searingly hot. "I told you I was too big, Elena," he whispered, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip. "Too much for this house, too much for you. And yet, here we are, trapped in the dark, while the vultures circle." "You're not too much for me, Arthur," she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stepped closer, her body nearly touching his. The physical proximity was overwhelming. She could smell the expensive tobacco, the faint scent of cedarwood, and the raw masculine pheromones of a man who had spent 3 days in a state of high alert. Arthur let out a low, ragged sound, halfway between a groan and a prayer. He grabbed her waist, his large hands nearly meeting around her middle, and pulled her flush against him. The contact was electric. Eleanor felt the hard, uncompromising planes of his chest against her breasts, the strength of his thighs against hers. He was a giant, a man built for war, and yet the way he held her was laced with a desperate, soul-deep hunger. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot against her skin. He didn't kiss her immediately. He simply held her, his body trembling with the effort of restraint. Elena wrapped her arms around his broad shoulders, her fingers tracing the scars on his back, wanting to heal the parts of him that the world had broken. "I've spent 15 years building a wall around myself," Arthur muttered against her skin, his voice thick with a vulnerability he only showed to her. "I thought if I got big enough, if I got powerful enough, the silence would never find me. But the silence was always there, Elena. It was waiting for me to be alone." "You're not alone," she whispered, pulling back just enough to look into his dark, turbulent eyes. She reached up and cupped his face, her thumbs smoothing the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. She leaned in, her lips grazing his jaw, then the corner of his mouth, before finally finding his lips in a kiss that was slow, deep, and filled with a quiet, burning intensity. It wasn't the kiss of a master and a servant. It was the collision of 2 souls who had found their anchor in the middle of a storm. Arthur's response was immediate and possessive. He lifted her easily, his hands molding her to him as if he were trying to pull her inside his own skin. He set her down on the edge of the large mahogany desk, the wood cool against her legs, while the fire raged behind them. He moved between her knees, his large frame completely enveloping her, his hands sliding up her thighs beneath the silk of her robe. The sensuality of the moment was a living thing, a hand on the flame that refused to be extinguished. Arthur's touch was deliberate and heavy, his fingers splaying across her skin with a slow rhythmic pressure that made Elena's breath hitch. He looked at her with a hunger that was almost frightening, a need that went far beyond the physical. "I could lose everything tonight," Arthur whispered against her lips. "The money, the docks, the reputation, all of it could vanish into the fog." "Let it," Elena replied, her hands tangling in his dark hair. "You're more than the things you own, Arthur. You're the man who stayed when everyone else ran. You're the man who loves his daughter more than his life. That's what I handle. That's what I keep." Arthur let out a sound of pure surrender. He kissed her again, his tongue demanding and dominant, his hands tracing the curves of her body with a reverence that made her feel like the most important thing in his empire. For a few hours, the siege outside didn't matter. The betrayal, the frozen accounts, and the men in the fog were all forgotten in the heat of the library. But as the fire began to burn low, Eleanor's mind, sharpened by the days of observation, began to drift back to the events that had led them here. She thought about the way the men looked at each other when Arthur wasn't in the room. She thought about the specific way the accounts had been hit, not randomly, but with a surgical precision that required intimate knowledge of the Thorn operations. Arthur had fallen into a light, fitful sleep, his head resting on her lap as she sat on the rug by the dying fire. Elena looked down at the giant, his face softened by rest, and realized something that he, in his paranoia, had missed. The strategy used against him wasn't just cold, it was familiar. It was a pattern she had seen before, not in the world of gangsters, but in the subtle games of power played in the houses of the elite. She realized that the betrayal wasn't just a grab for money. It was a personal vendetta, designed to make Arthur feel small. As the first hint of a grey dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the shutters, Eleanor reached for a notebook on the desk. She began to write, connecting the dots that Arthur's anger had blinded him to. The loop was opening. She had found the hidden strategy behind the siege, and as she watched the shadows retreat, she knew that today the nanny would become the strategist that would save the king. The dawn of December 20th, 1997, was a pale, sickly thing, struggling to pierce through the soot-stained fog of the city. Inside the library of the Thorn estate, the air was stale with the scent of dying embers and the sharp metallic tang of cold coffee. Arthur Thorn sat at his desk, his massive frame hunched over a map of his empire, his eyes tracing the lines of his defeat. He looked like a man who had been told he was a giant his whole life, only to find himself tied down by 1,000 tiny threads. Eleanor approached him from behind. She had spent the night watching the shadows and the ledgers, her mind spinning with a clarity that surprised her. She was wearing the same silk robe, the hem whispering against the rug, her feet still bare. She placed her hand on his shoulder, feeling the iron-hard tension in his muscle. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice a calm ripple in the heavy silence. "Look at this." He turned, his face a mask of exhaustion and brewing violence. "I've looked at everything, Elena. I've looked at the losses, the betrayals, the names. It's a dead end." "No," she said, sliding a notebook onto the desk. "You've been looking at it like a general. You're looking for a front line, for an army. But this isn't a war of soldiers. It's a war of surgeons." She leaned over the desk, her body pressing slightly against his arm. The warmth of her skin was a stark contrast to the cold paper. She pointed to a series of numbers she had circled in red. "Look at the timing of the seizures at the docks. Look at the specific accounts that were frozen. These aren't the moves of the Italians or Julian Vane. They don't have the patience for this." Arthur narrowed his eyes, his breath hitching as he felt the soft weight of her leaning into him. "Explain." "This is a burn-down strategy," Elena said, her voice growing more confident. "It's what the old money families do when they want to dismantle a rival without ever firing a shot. They don't attack your strength. They starve your infrastructure. Julian Vane is too arrogant to think of this, but someone who knows your history, someone who knows exactly where your too big ego is most vulnerable, they're the ones pulling the strings." Arthur's hand came up, his fingers wrapping around the back of her neck, pulling her closer until their foreheads touched. His skin was scorching, his gaze burning with a new, dark intensity. "And who do you think that is, little bird?" "It's Silas," she breathed, her heart hammering against his chest. "He hasn't been trying to take your chair, Arthur. He's been selling the blueprints of your house to Lord Sterling. The money isn't gone. It's being moved into an escrow account held by a shell company Silas founded 3 years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur's grip on her neck tightened, not in anger at her, but in a sudden, violent realization. He let out a low, guttural growl, his eyes flashing with a predatory light. He stood up, towering over her, his massive presence suddenly filled with a terrifying, focused energy. 3 years, he muttered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to shake the room. He's been waiting for me to get big enough to fall. He used your reputation against you, Eleanor said, stepping into his space. She reached up, her fingers splaying across his bare chest, feeling the frantic, powerful rhythm of his heart. He made sure everyone warned you that you were too big, so that when you started to lose control, you'd believe it was your own fault. Arthur looked down at her, his expression a mixture of profound shock and an all-consuming desire. He realized then that the girl he had hired to watch his daughter was the only person in the world who could actually see him. He reached out, his large hands grabbing her waist, hoisting her up onto the edge of the mahogany desk. The physical contact was like a bolt of lightning. Eleanor wrapped her legs around his waist, her silk robe falling open to reveal the pale, smooth expanse of her thighs. Arthur moved between her legs, his massive frame completely enveloping her. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot and ragged against her skin. "I spent 15 years thinking I was untouchable," Arthur whispered against her throat, his voice thick with a raw, masculine hunger. "I thought I had to be a giant to protect what was mine, but I was just a blind man standing in the middle of a forest." He pulled back, his hands sliding up her thighs, his thumbs tracing the line of her hips with a slow, deliberate pressure. The sensuality of the moment was overwhelming, a fire burning in the heart of the siege. He looked at her with a hunger that went beyond the physical, a need for her mind as much as her body. "You're the only thing that's real in this house, Elena," he muttered, his lips grazing hers. "The only thing I can handle." "I told you," she whispered back, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, pulling him down. "I can handle more than you think." He kissed her then, a deep, possessive reclamation that tasted of salt and coffee and a sudden, fierce hope. It wasn't the kiss of a man who was defeated. It was the kiss of a king who had just found his queen. His hands moved with a feverish intensity, tracing the curves of her body through the silk, claiming every inch of her as his own. The heat between them was a shield against the world outside, a sanctuary of skin and breath. Arthur's touch was heavy and deliberate, his fingers splaying across her ribcage, his thumb grazing the soft swell of her breast. Eleanor let out a soft, broken moan, her body arching into his. For a few minutes the betrayal and the too big warning didn't exist. There was only the weight of him, the smell of him, and the uncompromising reality of their desire. But the peace was shattered by a sudden, violent sound. A sharp metallic crack echoed from the foyer below, followed by the sound of glass shattering. The alarms didn't go off, which meant the security system had been bypassed from the inside. Arthur snapped back, his eyes instantly cold and lethal. He didn't let her down gently. He slid her off the desk, his hand reaching for the heavy iron fire poker as his eyes moved to the door. "The breach," he said, his voice a cold, flat line. "Silas isn't waiting for the accounts to clear. He's coming to finish it now." "He knows we're here," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. She reached for the notebook, tucking it into her robe. "Go to Rose," Arthur commanded, his voice full of the authority that had built his empire. "Take her to the nursery's hidden compartment. Do not come out until you hear my voice. If you hear anyone else, you know what to do." "Arthur!" He grabbed her face, kissing her one last time with a brutal, desperate intensity. "I'm the giant, Elena. Remember? I'll make sure they never get past the stairs." As she turned to run, the sound of heavy footsteps began to thud on the marble of the grand staircase. The loop was closing. The too big gangster was about to show his enemies exactly what happens when you corner a lion in his own den. The hidden strategy had been revealed, but the final cost of the betrayal was about to be paid in blood. The air in the grand foyer was shattered by the sound of 20-gauge lead-meeting mahogany. It was December 20th, 1997, and the fortress had fallen. Arthur Thorne stood at the top of the grand staircase, a silhouette of primal fury against the dim amber light of the upper hall. He didn't have a gun. He had a heavy iron poker and the raw, terrifying strength of a man who had nothing left to lose but the 2 lives behind him. "Go!" Arthur bellowed, his voice cracking like a whip. Elena didn't hesitate. She scooped Rose into her arms. the child's small body trembling with a silent, wide-eyed terror that mirrored her own. She ran toward the nursery, but the sound of heavy boots on the marble below told her the hidden compartment wouldn't be enough. Silas knew every inch of this house. He had helped Arthur map the renovations 10 years ago. She reached the nursery and didn't stop at the toy chest. She pushed aside the heavy wardrobe, revealing the narrow servants' passage that led to the old coal cellar. She could hear the muffled grunts of violence from the hallway, the sound of wood hitting bone, the roar of the giant defending his den. Minutes later, the heavy iron door of the coal cellar swung open. Arthur stumbled in, his white shirt now a tapestry of crimson and soot. His knuckles were raw, and a jagged cut above his eye was weeping blood into his beard. He looked less like a king and more like a wounded soldier, but the fire in his eyes was undimmed. "The back gate!" Arthur gasped, grabbing Elena's arm. His grip was frantic, his hand slick with sweat and copper. "Marcus is waiting with the sedan. We have to move before the yard or the Italians finish what Silas started." They burst out into the freezing London night. The fog had turned into a needle-sharp rain that stung the skin. They scrambled into the back of a nondescript black sedan that was idling in the narrow alleyway. Marcus slammed the car into gear, the tires screaming against the wet cobblestones as they tore away from the only home Rose had ever known. The escape was a blur of neon lights reflected in oil-slicked puddles. They wound through the narrow, twisting streets of the East End, doubling back through industrial estates and under railway arches to shake any tails. Arthur sat in the back, his massive frame hunched over, his arm wrapped around Elena and Rose with a possessiveness that felt like a cage of iron. "We can't go to the cottage," Arthur muttered, his voice a low, jagged vibration. "Silas knows the deeds. We go to the Hole." The Hole was a derelict apartment building in a part of the city where the street lamps had all been smashed and the air tasted of sulphur and despair. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the Thorn luxury. The hallway smelled of damp rot and stale cabbage, and the elevator had been dead since 1984. They climbed 4 flights of stairs in silence. The apartment was a single room with a stained mattress, a cracked sink, and a window reinforced with chicken wire. Arthur locked the 3 deadbolts and slumped against the door, his chest heaving. The giant was out of his palace, and the world suddenly felt far too small for him. "Rose, honey, lie down on the bed," Eleanor whispered, her voice remarkably steady. She laid the girl down and covered her with her own silk robe, the midnight blue fabric looking absurdly out of place in the grime of the room. Arthur watched them, his gaze heavy and turbulent. He looked at his hands, then at the peeling wallpaper. He looked like a man whose skin was suddenly too tight. The power dynamics had shifted in the span of an hour. In the estate, he was the master of all he surveyed. Here, he was just a hunted man in a box. "I failed," Arthur said, the words falling like lead stones into the quiet of the room. "I grew too big, and I tripped over my own shadow. I've brought you to a rat hole, Elena. I've lost the docks, the house, the reputation, everything." Elena walked toward him. The room was cold, the only heat coming from a sputtering radiator that clanked like a dying machine. She reached out and took his large, blood-stained hands in hers. She didn't flinch at the gore. She began to wipe the blood away with a damp rag she found by the sink. "You haven't lost me," she said, her voice a soft, fierce anchor. "And you haven't lost your daughter. The docks were just wood and water, Arthur. This is the man I said I could handle." Arthur let out a low, broken sound. He sank to the floor, pulling her down with him until they were both sitting on the cold linoleum. He buried his face in her lap, his massive shoulders shaking with the silent, racking sobs of a man whose world had ended. Elena held him, her fingers tangling in his dark, matted hair, her body acting as a shield against the darkness of the room. The physical proximity was intense, born from the raw adrenaline of their flight. Arthur pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes dark with a desperate, soul-deep hunger. He reached out, his hand sliding up her thigh, the heat of his palm searing through the thin fabric of her dress. "I have nothing to give you now," he whispered, his breath hot against her lips. "No jewels, no security, no future. Just this." "Then give me this," she breathed back. He kissed her then, and it wasn't the kiss of a king. It was the kiss of a survivor, It tasted of salt, iron, and a sudden, violent need to feel alive. His hands moved with a feverish urgency, claiming the curves of her body as if they were the only territory he had left. Elena arched into him, her hands finding the hard planes of his chest, feeling the frantic, powerful thrum of his heart. In the gritty silence of the safe house, the sensuality was overwhelming. The smell of his sweat and the copper of his blood mingled with the scent of her lavender, a collision of life and death. He pressed her back against the cold wall, his massive frame enveloping her, his hands exploring her with a reverence that made her feel like a holy relic in a wasteland. "I'm too big for this room," Arthur groaned against her throat, his voice thick with desire. "I'm too much for this life." "You're exactly where you need to be," she whispered, her fingers digging into his shoulders. For an hour, the world outside, the betrayal of Silas, the hunt by the Italians, the frozen accounts didn't exist. There was only the heat of their skin and the rhythmic, desperate dance of two people who had found their home in each other's arms. But as the adrenaline began to fade, leaving them tangled together on the floor, the cold reality of their situation returned. Arthur sat up, his back against the door, his hand resting on the heavy iron bar he had used to defend the stairs. He looked at Elena, who was adjusting her dress, her face flushed and her eyes bright with a new, dangerous knowledge. "We can't stay here long," Arthur said, his voice regaining its lethal edge. "Silas will check the old bolt holes eventually, but he won't check the one place he thinks I've already lost." "The docks?" Elena asked, her mind already racing. Arthur nodded, a dark, calculating smile touching his lips. "He thinks I'm running. He thinks the giant is scared. He's forgotten that a wounded lion is the most dangerous thing in the woods." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass key he had taken from a hidden safe in the coal cellar. "There's a warehouse at Pier 10. It's not in the ledgers. It's where I keep the things I never wanted anyone to see. My final insurance policy." The loop was opening. The retreat was over. The too big gangster was preparing his counterattack, but as he looked at the girl who had saved his soul in a rat-infested apartment, he realized his insurance policy wasn't in a warehouse. It was standing right in front of him. The morning of December 21st, 1997, leaked into the safe house like a grey poison. There was no sun, only a sharpening of the shadows in the corners of the room. The radiator had given up its rhythmic clanking and now sat cold and silent, leaving the air in the small apartment tasting of frost and old dust. Arthur Thorne lay on the stained mattress, his large frame making the bed look like a child's toy. He was shivering, not from the cold, but from the fire burning in the jagged wound above his eye and the deep bruising along his ribs. He tried to sit up, his muscles screaming in protest. He was a man who had spent 15 years being a wall that nothing could penetrate, but this morning the wall was crumbling. "Stay down, Arthur." Elena's voice came from the small kitchenette. She appeared a moment later, carrying a bowl of steaming water and a few torn strips of a clean white sheet she had found in a cupboard. "I don't have time to lie down," Arthur growled, his voice a wreckage of its former authority. He winced as he tried to shift his weight. "Silas is out there consolidating. Every hour I'm in this room is an hour he's convincing my men that the giant is dead." Elena didn't argue. She sat on the edge of the mattress, her weight causing the old springs to groan. She placed a hand on his chest, her palm flat against the dark hair and the heat of his skin. The contact was immediate, a silent command that he couldn't ignore. "You can't lead an army if you can't walk, Arthur. Let me look at you." She began to unbutton the remnants of his white shirt. Her fingers were steady, moving with a clinical precision that masked the frantic beating of her heart. As the fabric fell away, she saw the true cost of the breach. His torso was a map of violence, purple and black blooms across his ribs where the lead had hit his vest, and a long, shallow graze across his shoulder where a blade had found its mark. Arthur watched her, his breathing shallow. He looked at her pale face, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, and the way her lips were pressed together in a thin line of resolve. The shield he had carried for a decade, the reputation of being too big to be hurt, was lying in pieces on the linoleum floor. "It looks worse than it feels," he lied, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "Don't lie to me," she whispered. She dipped a cloth into the hot water and pressed it against the wound on his forehead. Arthur hissed, his hand flying up to catch her wrist. His grip was still powerful, but there was a tremor in it he couldn't hide. He looked into her eyes, seeing not the fear he was used to, but a fierce, unwavering devotion that made his throat tighten. "I'm too heavy for you, Elena," he muttered, his thumb tracing the delicate bones of her wrist. "This life, the weight of it. It'll break your back if you try to carry it with me." "My back is stronger than you think," she replied, her gaze never wavering. She pulled her wrist from his grip and returned to his wounds. The room was silent, save for the sound of the rain hitting the chicken wire window. The intimacy of the moment was overwhelming. Elena moved the cloth down to his chest, wiping away the dried blood and the soot of the estate. Her touch was light, but the heat between them was a physical force, a slow-burning fire that ignored the chill of the room. As she worked, the lines of tension in Arthur's face began to soften. He reached out, his large, scarred hand finding the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the soft waves of her hair. He pulled her closer until her face was inches from his. The scent of her, lavender and something warm and life-giving, was the only thing keeping the darkness of the city at bay. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his voice thick with a sudden, raw vulnerability. "You have the money. You have the car. You could have taken Rose and disappeared." "Because a giant who thinks he's alone is just a target," she whispered, her lips grazing his jaw as she moved to clean the graze on his shoulder. "But a man who knows he's loved. He's a king." Arthur let out a low, tortured groan. He pulled her down onto him, his arms wrapping around her with a sudden, violent possessiveness. The physical contact was an explosion of sensation. Elena felt the hard planes of his chest pressing against her breasts, the raw masculine strength of his thighs, and the uncompromising reality of his desire. He moved his hand from her neck to her waist, his fingers splaying across her hip, with a slow, rhythmic pressure that made her blood hum. He looked at her with a hunger that went beyond the physical, a need to be seen, to be known, and to be held in the wreckage of his world. "I have nothing left to give you but this moment," Arthur whispered against her lips. "It's all I want," she breathed back. He kissed her then, a deep, desperate reclamation that tasted of salt and iron. It was the kiss of a man who had lost his empire, but found his soul. His hands moved with a feverish intensity, tracing the curves of her body through the thin fabric of her dress, claiming her as his sanctuary in a world of betrayal. The sensuality of the safe house was a stark, brutal thing. There were no silk sheets or sapphire brooches here, only the heat of their skin and the desperate rhythmic dance of two people who had found their home in the middle of a war. Arthur's touch was heavy and deliberate, his fingers pressing into her skin with a reverence that made her feel like the most powerful thing in his universe. He shifted his weight, pulling her more fully onto the mattress, his massive frame enveloping her. Elena felt the raw power of him, the strength that had built a city now focused entirely on her. She tangled her fingers in his hair, pulling him closer, her body arching into his with a sudden, fierce need. For an hour, the shields were completely broken. The two big Gangster and the innocent Nanny were gone, replaced by a man and a woman who were simply trying to stay alive in the dark. But as the grey light of noon began to hit the chicken wire, the world outside returned. Arthur sat up, his body still aching, but his eyes were now clear and lethal. He looked at the brass key lying on the bedside table, the key to the warehouse at Pier 10. "We leave at dusk," Arthur said, his voice regaining its cold, strategic edge. "Silas will be expecting me to run for the border. He won't be expecting me to go to the one place where I keep my teeth." He looked at Elena, who was sitting up beside him, her hair a wild halo, and her eyes bright with a new, dangerous resolve. "You stay with Rose at the perimeter," Arthur commanded. "Marcus will be there. If things go wrong, he has orders to get you to the docks in Dover. You don't look back, Elena, not for anything." "I'm not leaving you, Arthur," she said, her voice a flat, uncompromising line. "This isn't the nursery, Elena. This is the end of the line. I'm going to show them why I grew so big in the first place, and it's not going to be pretty." He stood up, his massive frame blocking the light from the window. He looked like the giant again, but this time the armor was different. It wasn't built of reputation or money. It was built of the woman who was currently watching him with the eyes of a queen. The loop was opening. The final confrontation was being mapped in the shadows of a derelict apartment. The too big gangster was going to Pier 10 to reclaim his crown, but as he looked at Elena one last time before preparing his weapons, he realized that if he survived the night, the world would never be the same again. The shadows of December 22nd, 1997, were long and jagged, stretching across the salt-crusted docks of East London like the fingers of a skeletal hand. The air tasted of rust and the coming snow. Arthur Thorne sat in the front seat of a battered grey van, his hands gripped so tightly around the steering wheel that the leather groaned. Behind him, in the cramped cargo area, Marcus was checking the action on a heavy industrial stapler, a tool that, in the wrong hands, was as lethal as any firearm. They were parked outside a derelict pub called the Admiral's Rest. It was a neutral ground, or as neutral as any place could be in a city that was currently hunting for Arthur's head. Inside, a man known only as the Broker was waiting. He was the one who had facilitated Arthur's rise, and now he was the one offering a way down. "Stay here," Arthur commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl. He looked at Elena, who sat in the passenger seat. She was wearing a heavy wool coat, her hands tucked into her pockets, her face a mask of quiet, burning intensity. "If I'm not back in 15 minutes, Marcus takes you to the river." "You're coming back, Arthur," Elena said. It wasn't a question. It was an order. Arthur stepped out into the biting wind, his massive frame cutting through the fog. Inside the pub, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer and the ghosts of old sailors. The Broker sat at a corner table, his face a map of fine lines and expensive tobacco. "You've grown too big, Artie," the Broker said, not looking up from his glass of gin. "So big that you've become a silhouette. Everyone can see you, but no one can see behind you. Silas has made a deal with the Italians and Lord Stirling. They want the northern routes, the docks, and your head on a spike to discourage the next man who thinks he can own London." "I didn't come here for a history lesson," Arthur replied, his voice echoing in the empty pub. "There is a way out," the Broker continued, finally looking up. "I've spoken to Stirling. If you sign over the deeds to Pier 10 and the offshore accounts Silas hasn't touched yet, and if you agree to leave the country tonight, never to return, they'll let you go. You, the girl, and the child. You'll be small, Artie. You'll be a nobody in a seaside town in Spain, but you'll be alive." Arthur felt a surge of cold, white-hot fury. To be small, to be the man who ran. It was a fate worse than death for a man who had built his life on the bedrock of respect and power. He looked at his hands, the hands that had shaped the underground of a great city. "I won't be made small," Arthur whispered, the words vibrating with the weight of 1,000 battles. "I won't let them take what I built while I'm still breathing." "Then you're a dead man," the Broker said simply, "and the girl will be the first one they use to make you watch your own ending." Arthur turned and walked out, the heavy oak door slamming behind him. When he got back to the van, his face was a mask of granite. He didn't say a word as he pulled away, the tires throwing up grey slush. They returned to a secondary staging area, a small, windowless garage near the marshes. The silence inside was oppressive. Arthur began to prepare his weapons, his movements mechanical and cold. But Elena saw the truth. She saw the way his shoulders were slumped, the way he looked at Rose's sleeping form in the corner. He was preparing to die for a reputation that had already become his prison. "He offered you a way out, didn't he?" Elena asked, walking toward him. "It wasn't a way out. It was a surrender," Arthur growled, not looking at her. "He wanted me to be small. He wanted me to crawl away like a dog." "And instead you're going to walk into Pier 10 and let them kill you," she said, her voice a sharp, clear bell in the darkness. "You think that's being big, Arthur? That's just being stubborn." Arthur spun around, his hand grabbing her waist and pulling her flush against him. The physical contact was immediate and overwhelming. He looked down at her, his eyes dark with a desperate, soul-deep conflict. The heat of his body was a physical weight, his massive frame enveloping her in the cold garage. "I am Arthur Thorne," he roared, his voice shaking the corrugated metal walls. "I don't run, I don't hide." "You're a father," Elena countered, her hands finding the lapels of his heavy coat. She pulled him down until their faces were inches apart. The scent of lavender and rain-slicked wool mingled between them. "And you're the man I love. If you die tonight for a pile of rust and some shipping containers, you're not a giant. You're a failure." Arthur let out a low, tortured groan. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot and ragged against her skin. He held her with a possessiveness that was almost frightening, his large hands splaying across her back, as if he could pull her inside his own skin. The sensuality of the moment was laced with the sharp, metallic taste of grief. "I can't let them win, Elena," he whispered against her skin. "If I lose my name, I have nothing." "You have me," she breathed back, her fingers tangling in his dark hair. She pulled back just enough to look him in the eye. "But you can't win this with a gun, Arthur. They're expecting the giant to roar. They're not expecting the nanny to speak." "No," Arthur said, his eyes widening as he realized what she was suggesting. "Absolutely not." "Silas thinks I'm just a distraction," Elena said, her voice growing more confident. "He thinks I'm your handle. He won't see me as a threat. If I go to Pier 10 ahead of you, if I deliver the surrender documents the broker talked about, I can get inside. I can see where they've placed the men. I can open the side gate." "I will not use you as bait," Arthur bellowed, his grip on her waist tightening until it was almost painful. "You're not using me," she said, her voice dropping to a seductive, dangerous whisper. She reached up and traced the line of his lower lip, her thumb pressing down until he let out a low breath. "I'm choosing this. I told you I could handle you, Arthur. Now let me handle them." She leaned in and kissed him, a deep, desperate seal of her resolve. It tasted of salt and the cold winter air. Arthur responded with a primal, agonizing hunger, his tongue demanding and dominant, his hands tracing the curves of her body as if he were memorizing her for the last time. The physical proximity was a tidal wave, a collision of his dark world and her unwavering light. For a long moment, the giant was still. He looked at her, seeing the steel in her eyes that mirrored the sapphire at her throat. He realized that the virgin nanny he had hired was the only person in the city with a heart big enough to hold his empire together. "You have 10 minutes, Arthur said, his voice thick with a new kind of dread. "If that gate doesn't open in 10 minutes, I'm coming through the front wall with the van, and I won't stop until everyone is dead." "I only need 5, Elena replied. As she stepped out of the garage and into the shadows of the night, Arthur watched her go. He felt a weight in his chest that no amount of power could lift. He had been warned he was too big, but as he checked the magazine of his sidearm, he realized he had never felt smaller. The sacrifice was in motion. The nanny was walking into the lion's den, and the giant was left waiting in the dark, praying that the woman he loved was bigger than the world that was trying to destroy them both. The iron door of Pier 10 groaned as it swung open, a sound that seemed to carry across the black water of the Thames like a dying man's last breath. It was the night of December 22nd, 1997. Elena stepped into the cavernous warehouse, her small frame swallowed by the towering stacks of shipping containers and the skeletal remains of rusted cranes. The air was frigid, tasting of salt, diesel, and the metallic tang of impending violence. She was alone, or rather she appeared to be. She could feel the eyes of hidden men tracing the line of her wool coat, sensing the vulnerability that she was using as her primary armor. She clutched a leather portfolio to her chest, the documents inside representing the surrender Arthur had refused to sign. "Stop right there, little bird," a voice drawled from the shadows of a crane. Silas stepped into the dim circle of a single overhead bulb. He looked different than he had at the estate. The mask of the loyal lieutenant had been discarded, replaced by the cold, hungry eyes of a man who had waited too long for his turn at the throne. Behind him, 3 men in dark overcoats stepped out, their hands tucked into their pockets in a way that suggested they were holding more than just their keys. "You're a long way from the nursery, Elena," Silas said, a thin, cruel smile touching his lips. "Artie must be truly desperate if he's sending his nanny to do a man's job." "Arthur is many things, Silas, but desperate isn't one of them," Elena replied. Her voice was steady, a clear, ringing note in the oppressive silence of the warehouse. She walked forward until she was only 10 feet from him. "He sent me to offer you the deeds. He's realized the giant is too big for this city now. He wants peace. Silas let out a harsh, jagged laugh. Peace? There is no peace for a man like Arthur Thorne. There is only the void he leaves behind. Give me the papers. Elena didn't move. She felt the weight of the 10 minutes Arthur had given her ticking away in her mind. She thought of the way his hands had felt on her skin in the library, the way his heartbeat had thrummed against her ear in the safe house. That memory was a fire in her veins, keeping the cold at bay. I'll give you the papers, Elena said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. But you should know that what's in this portfolio isn't just a surrender. It's a roadmap. Silas frowned, his eyes narrowing. A roadmap to what? To the £32 million you moved into the sterling escrow account, she said. The silence that followed was absolute. Silas's face went pale, then a mottled, angry red. I've spent the last 4 nights looking at the things you thought Arthur was too big to notice. I know about the shell company in the British Virgin Islands. I know about the kickbacks from the Italians. She took a step closer, her gaze locked on his. If anything happens to me or to Arthur, those files are set to be delivered to the Internal Revenue and the Special Branch. You won't be a king, Silas. You'll be an inmate. The men behind Silas shifted uncomfortably. The power dynamic in the room was warping, the innocent girl suddenly becoming the most dangerous person in the warehouse. Silas reached out, his hand grabbing her throat, his thumb pressing into her windpipe. It was an act of raw, panicked aggression. Elena didn't struggle. She looked him in the eye, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She felt the heat of her own defiance, a sensual, violent energy that she had learned from the giant. You think you're big enough to handle this? She wheezed. You're just a small man playing in a giant's shadow. Silas's grip tightened, his face inches from hers. I'll kill you and find the files myself. You have 5 seconds to let her go, a voice boomed from the darkness. It wasn't a roar. It was a cold, flat promise. Arthur Thorne stepped out from behind a stack of crates, his massive frame illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the skylights. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding the heavy iron bar from the safe house, his knuckles white, his shoulders stretching the fabric of his coat until the seams groaned. Artie, Silas hissed, dropping his hand from Elena's throat. He stepped back, his eyes darting toward his men. You're late, and you're alone. I'm never alone, Arthur said. As if on cue, the side gate of the warehouse groaned open. Marcus and 6 men stepped through, their faces masked, their presence a silent, lethal wall. Elena moved toward Arthur, her legs feeling like water. He caught her with one arm, pulling her flush against his side. The physical contact was an explosion of relief and possessive heat. She could feel the vibration of his fury through his ribs, the raw, masculine power of him acting as a shield. I gave you 10 minutes, Arthur whispered against her hair, his voice thick with a mixture of pride and terror. You took 12. I had to make sure he heard me, she breathed back. Arthur turned his gaze back to Silas. The too big gangster looked at the man who had betrayed him, and for the first time there was no paranoia in his eyes. There was only the cold, surgical focus of a man who had found his purpose. The files Elena mentioned are real, Silas, Arthur said, his voice echoing through the warehouse. But she missed one detail. I don't need the police to dismantle you. I've already spoken to the Italians. I told them you were the one who skimmed their last shipment. They're waiting outside the perimeter. They don't care about deeds or escrow accounts. They only care about blood. Silas looked toward the main doors, his bravado crumbling. The sound of heavy engines idling in the distance began to vibrate through the floorboards. The vultures had arrived, but they weren't there for the giant. Arthur, wait, Silas started, but Arthur turned away. He led Elena toward the side gate, his arm never leaving her waist. He didn't look back at the warehouse or the men he had once trusted. He walked with the heavy, deliberate grace of a man who was no longer carrying the weight of an empire, but the weight of a family. As they stepped out into the freezing night, the first flakes of snow began to fall, dusting the black water of the Thames in white. Arthur stopped by the car, pulling Elena into his arms for a deep, desperate kiss that tasted of victory and the promise of a future. The physical proximity was overwhelming, a collision of their worlds that had finally found its balance. "The giant is dead," Arthur whispered against her lips. "From tomorrow I'm just a man." "A man I can handle," she whispered back. The loop was closing. The final gamble had been played, and the results were echoing through the docks in the form of fading shouts and the cold, indifferent wind. Arthur Thorne had been warned he was too big, but in the shadows of Pier 10, he had realized that the only thing that truly mattered was the girl who had been big enough to save him. The morning of December 24th, 1997, arrived with a silence so profound it felt like the world had been reset. In the rolling hills of the countryside, far from the soot-choked alleys of London and the cold, salt-stained docks of the East End, the air was crisp and smelled of pine needles and wood smoke. A thick layer of fresh snow covered the cottage, turning the modest stone building into a sanctuary of white and silver. Arthur Thorne stood on the wooden porch, his breath hitching in the frigid air. He was dressed in a heavy cable-knit sweater and worn trousers, clothes that lacked the sharp, aggressive tailoring of his former life. His large frame, once a silhouette of terror for his enemies, now seemed to fit the rugged landscape. The scars on his face were still there, memories of a war that was finally over, but the hardness in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady light. He looked back through the window. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, throwing orange light across the room. Rose was sitting on a thick rug, focused on decorating a small fir tree with strings of popcorn. Beside her, Eleanor moved with a grace that still made Arthur's heart skip a beat. She was wearing a soft forest green dress that echoed the colors of the woods outside. The too big empire was gone. The Thorne estate had been liquidated through a series of complex legal maneuvers that Elena had masterminded, leaving enough to ensure a comfortable, quiet life for 3 generations, but not enough to attract the vultures of the underground. Silas was a ghost, a name whispered in the dark corners of the city, and the Italians had moved on to smaller, easier targets. Arthur stepped back inside, the warmth of the house hitting him like a physical embrace. He walked toward Elena, his heavy footsteps muffled by the wood floors. When he reached her, he didn't say a word. He simply wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, pulling her flush against his massive chest. The physical contact was immediate and grounded. Eleanor leaned back into him, her head resting against his shoulder. The scent of her, that intoxicating mix of lavender and the heat of her skin, was the only empire Arthur cared to rule now. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot and ragged with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. "I keep waiting for the ground to shake," Arthur whispered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that resonated through both of them. "I keep waiting for the sirens or the sound of the gate being breached." Eleanor turned in his arms, her hands coming up to cradle his face. Her fingers were warm, her touch a stark contrast to the cold wind outside. She looked at him with an intensity that saw every scar, every secret and every ounce of the man he had become. "The gate is closed, Arthur," she said, her voice a soft, fierce anchor. "The giant isn't being hunted anymore. He's home." "I don't know how to be a man without a war to fight," he admitted, his voice dropping to a seductive, vulnerable rasp. "You're not without a war," she whispered, her lips grazing his jaw. "You're just fighting for something different now. You're fighting for her, and for us." Arthur let out a low groan of surrender. He picked her up easily, his hands molding her to him, with a possessiveness that was no longer built on fear, but on a deep, soul-deep devotion. He set her down on the edge of the heavy oak table, moving between her knees as he had done in the library and the safe house. But this time, the tension wasn't born of adrenaline. It was born of a slow, burning desire that had finally found its peace. He ran his hands up her thighs, the fabric of her dress sliding against his palms. The sensuality of the moment was overwhelming, a fire in the hearth of their new life. He looked at her, his dark eyes tracing every feature of her face. The virgin Nanny was gone, replaced by the strategist, the partner, and the woman who had handled the man everyone else was too afraid to touch. "I was warned I was too big for my own good," Arthur muttered, his lips inches from hers. "They were right. I was too big for that world. It couldn't hold me." "It was too small for you, Arthur," Eleanor breathed back, her fingers tangling in his hair. "You needed a world that was big enough to hold your heart, not just your reputation." He kissed her then, a deep, lingering seal of their new dynasty. It tasted of wood smoke, salt, and the promise of 1,000 mornings just like this one. His hands moved with a reverence that made her feel like a holy relic, claiming her not as a trophy, but as his equal. The physical proximity was a tidal wave of sensation, a collision of two souls who had survived the storm and found the shore. As they finally pulled away, breathless and flushed, Rose looked up from the tree, her dark eyes bright with a happiness they hadn't seen in 2 years. "Daddy, look," she chirped, pointing to the star she had finally managed to place on the top branch. Arthur walked over and lifted his daughter onto his shoulders, his massive frame easily supporting the weight of his future. He looked at Eleanor, who was standing by the fire, her eyes shining with a quiet, triumphant light. The too big gangster was dead, buried in the rubble of Pier 10. In his place was a man who knew the value of a quiet room and the strength of a soft hand. He had lost an empire of shadows, but he had gained a dynasty of light. As the sun began to set behind the snow-capped hills, casting long purple shadows across the landscape, Arthur realized that resilience wasn't about standing tall while the world tried to knock you down. It was about knowing when to let the world fall away so you could hold on to the only thing that mattered. The loop was closed. The story that had begun in a rain-soaked study in London had found its ending in a quiet cottage in the woods. And as the stars began to appear in the clear winter sky, Arthur Thorne finally let out a breath he had been holding for 15 years. He was small enough to be happy and big enough to keep the woman he loved safe forever.